Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I hope everyone had a restful and relaxing evening, and it seems like the bad weather that plagued us a little bit earlier on, or at least for some arriving, has moved off and a beautiful day. So we will go ahead and get started right away this morning with some remarks from Hari Stephen Kumar from Amherst College. We'll be speaking on pedagogical frameworks for the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm Hari Stephen Kumar. I'm the Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Collaborative at Amherst College. I'm also the Director of Instructional and Curricular Design Services at Amherst. Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you, LACOL, for having me here. It's been a wonderful day already, and as we get started with our second day, I'm excited about our workshops ahead of us and the plenary talk day from Candace Steele. So my overview today, I wanted to basically just go back to a little bit about what do we mean by liberal arts and what are some key questions for us to answer. And from there, I wanted to cover three, what I'm calling emerging frameworks. And as you see, one of them has actually been with us for quite a while, and so it's kind of misleading to call it emerging. But the frameworks are about deep learning, about threshold concepts, and about inclusive pedagogies. So a little bit about me. I have a bit of a vagabond itinerary. And a full disclosure, I don't have a liberal arts background. I didn't go to a liberal arts school. I was born in India, but I grew up in Yemen to Indian immigrant parents who pushed me into STEM. And so a lot of my undergraduate education and my graduate education was in engineering. But as I worked in engineering, the kinds of things that I got really interested in were teaching, and really about teaching young people how to question rhetorics of fundamentalism, because that had a big impact on me growing up. So of course, the kinds of things I wanted to teach were the kinds of things that engineers didn't have formula for: race, religion, politics, non-controversial things. So I left engineering and came back to graduate school in the humanities, got my master's in performance studies, slowly working on my PhD in English. In the meantime, I got really interested in working with faculty. My own stories about why teaching meant a lot to me had to do with seeing that light of learning happen for students. And when working with faculty, some of the most meaningful experiences I've had is when I see that light of teaching go on for faculty. When faculty kind of fall back in love with teaching, that makes it all worthwhile for me. So that's what I've been doing at Amherst College for a couple of years now, and that's where a lot of this work comes from. It also comes from these folks. These are my kids, and that's my oldest right there, and this is at her kindergarten, and that's my middle guy, and that's my little guy, Gabriel, who's turning 2 tomorrow on Father's Day. And you can see that they're kind of like ready for whatever is going to happen to them. They're ready to be enculturated into the K-12 school system with varying degrees of enthusiasm about this. You can see that he's already kind of bored. She's kind of excited but this is her kindergarten after all, this is her domain. And he's ready to scoot. He's ready to get out of there. And in fact, he would rather go find something cool to do. So I thought if we can go back to the Liberal Arts Consortium for Learning, what do we mean by liberal arts education? What are our educational goals and values? What pedagogical frameworks are best suited for our mission? And especially, what are those emerging ideas that can help us transform the way we do things, especially to meet a wider range of students, wider population, but also to meet a more complex set of global challenges? Those two things really help me keep myself grounded when I'm working with faculty, when I'm working with students, and when I'm dealing with all these narratives in higher ed. Every article I read in the Chronicle asks me, to ground myself into, well, what does that mean for this set of problems? Okay. All right, well, fine, we are the Liberal Arts Consortium for Online Learning, but what should online and blended mean in the context of our mission? What approaches would enhance our place-based and our digital experiences? And especially, what are those emerging approaches that have the potential to innovate ways of teaching and learning that we're actually really well suited for? A lot of ed tech companies will try to sell us products that they say are student-centered, and what they mean by student-centered is actually consumer-centered. And there's a lot of questions around scalability. You know, how do you scale this to thousands of consumers, 10,000s of consumers? But in the liberal arts, in residential liberal arts, maybe we can innovate things that are at human scale. And what might those innovations be? Okay. We're a consortium, so why? Why do this together? What possibilities might we engage in together that we may not be able to do individually on our campuses? I'm particularly interested in, what influences and leverages can we have on the liberal arts, but on higher education policy more broadly, because of our work as a consortium. When people make grand sweeping statements about the liberal arts, are they consulting with us? Do we have an influence on those conversations? Why or why not? All right, so what is a liberal arts education? Ironic, because from somebody who's not had a liberal arts background, for me to ask this question, but it's been interesting for me to ask this question because I'm curious. If I'm working in a liberal arts institution, I better know a little bit about what that means. So the AACU statement in 2008, I think many of you might be familiar with this. This is actually one paragraph. This is their leading paragraph, and I've split it apart into 3 sentences. So liberal education is an approach that empowers individuals for complexity, diversity, and change. The idea that we're now training students for a world that we ourselves are not well trained for. So how do we prepare students for something that we don't know what they're going to actually encounter? How do we prepare students to be nimble, agile, able to solve problems with each other, with people whom can't even imagine working with? Right? There's the sort of standard dichotomy of breadth and depth. But then there's this interesting sentence: a liberal education helps students develop a sense of social responsibility, as well as strong, transferable, intellectual, practical skills, and a demonstrated ability to apply knowledge and skills in real-world settings. Reason why I get kind of interested in statements like this, even though after you see a few of these, your eyes tend to gloss over, and you're like, okay, this is all just kind of corporate ed speak, is that I'm on the curriculum committee at Amherst College, and we are parsing a lot of words in that. So a lot of these words for me have meaning, mainly because this provides a way of stepping away from the kind of content versus skills dichotomy. Often faculty will say, well, I'd like to teach that skill, but I don't want to give up on this really important content that I have to cover, right? What the AACU statement says is that if you think about what should students be learning from a liberal arts education, there are 4 broad kind of outcomes, and knowledge and skills are only the first 2. Right? There's this added layer of civic knowledge, engagement, ethical reasoning, lifelong learning, and then an integrative and applied learning focus for this. What I like about the way that they emphasize these is that they anchor each of these into a substantial, meaningful, relational experience. That these are not things you can just learn from a textbook. These are not things you can just learn in isolation. These are all things that you best learn when they're integrated. So that's the real challenge, is how to integrate these things. So stepping away from just the content skills dichotomy, if we think of engagement with difference, and if we think of this as a loop, how do we best design a 4-year learning experience across the curriculum and the co-curriculum that helps our students learn across all 4 of these domains? Now, this might actually seem a little familiar to those of us who know a little bit about Bloom's, and this is a kind of echo from the past. Bloom's taxonomy revised in 2001. A lot of people get very excited about revisions. And of course, this is a way of thinking about learning happening in different cognitive domains that increase in kind of complexity. And I like to think of Bloom's as really a layered approach to deeper learning. I like to think of the first 2 layers in Bloom's as primarily about content. I'm calling it very vulgarly knowing. The second 2 layers, to me, are traditionally where our assignments get grounded. We ask students to apply, to solve a problem, to write an analytical paper. And the last 2 layers are really about habits of mind, are really about learning some disciplinary specific ways of evaluating and creating. And those are things that we hope are transferable, right? We hope that being able to learn how to do that in conjunction with all of these equips somebody to take on a new challenge, right? And be able to bring discipline-specific approaches of thinking to that new challenge. Now, it turns out that this is not really emerging. A lot of people have been working on this. The National Survey of Student Engagement has thought about how do you know if students are really engaged in deep learning? And here are some key indicators. Right? Is there academic challenge? Are students actually being scaffolded through into that higher order learning? Are they being asked to reflect and integrate their learning? Do they learn learning strategies? Is there a metacognitive element to their learning? Similarly, the kinds of things they do with others. So is this not just an isolated thing, but how well are they learning with peers, and how well are they learning how to learn with peers? What are their experiences with faculty? And more broadly, what is the campus environment like? How is it supportive of a wider range of students? The AACU has also looked at what are the kinds of practices that have been shown to have a tremendous impact on retention, especially of students of color and underrepresented students. And it turns out that there's this list of practices. And you can see some of the usual suspects there. But I'll caution you on two different things. One is, just because we might have internships, or just because we might have writing-intensive courses, doesn't necessarily make them high impact. It really matters how these are designed and how well they're integrated across the board. And the other thing is that these by themselves don't really guarantee that this is a high impact environment, right? There has to be a more integrated, holistic view of what the campus's vision is for inclusion and for retention. But if we think about what is it that actually makes these high impact, right? It turns out that practices that involve a significant amount of time, commitment, and purpose from students, practices that require students to have extended substantive interaction with others, especially activities that really involve a lot of collaborative engagement with difference. Anything that gives students a lot of formative feedback, opportunities for continuous improvement in low-stakes ways. Things that challenge students with complexity and novel, relevant problems. So another way to think about it is, if you have a way of teaching that features some of these practices, even if that's not one of the things on this list, that still is going to have a high impact, right? So if you put both of these together, what we realize is that deep learning is a disruptive liberal art. I really wanted to avoid the word disruption because there are a lot of snake oil peddlers out there who are talking about disrupting the model of higher ed. And I think they're onto something, but I think it's a mistake to think of just disruption as the threat to higher ed. What both of the high impact practices and the NESI indicators show is that if you want to teach for deeper learning, teaching toward this looks very different. Teaching toward deeper learning looks a lot like mentoring, coaching, role modeling. It's very facilitative. And deep learning looks, it's not individual, it's collaborative, it's relational, it's intrinsically motivated, it's personally meaningful. Ideally, we want to see students who take on learning as a personally meaningful, relational, collaborative, intrinsically motivated ways. And teaching and learning together involve a lot of feedback, a lot of low-stakes opportunities for practice. That looks very different from the context of some really larger schools where the focus is really at scalability, the focus is on cost volume benefits, the focus is on standardization, the focus is on automated grading. So we should be cautious about ed tech companies, about solutions out there that try to emphasize that what we can solve if we use their approaches are problems of scale, problems of cost volume, problems of automated grading, right? Really, what our institutions are set up for, what our relational context is set up for, is success at this level. So what are some technologies that actually are geared toward this approach more so than this approach? Okay. And this is not really, Bloom's has been around for a while. A lot of us know about Bloom's. So why is this emerging? Because thinking of this disruptively allows us to look at how our current approaches actually missed, what alignments are we missing? So here, for example, is a fairly typical syllabus breakout of grades. 10% for reflection posts, 5% for in-class presentations, but then 85% of the grade is on writing. First paper, second paper, third paper. And so if you think about, for example, reading, right, and we ask, why are students not doing the reading? Right? Well, it turns out that many of the readings that we assign are actually writings, and they're writings at this level, right? And often these are writings that are not really designed to be pedagogical. I'm painting with a very broad brush here. I realize that some of the readings involve textbooks and so on, but if you think of humanities classes, if you think of even science classes where we assign journal articles, right, those are really not designed to be pedagogical. But students read them as if these are supposed to be exemplars, models of what their writing is supposed to be. Writing assignments expect work at this level. And when we assign a reading, we kind of assume that a student's going to read the reading. One thing, first, we assume that they'll actually read the reading. And second, by reading the reading, they'll have achieved mastery at this level. And why wouldn't students kind of skip the readings a little bit if the signal they're getting is that most of the work that matters in this course is in writing? Where are we giving them feedback between these different levels? When is that feedback happening? Is it happening in class, or is it happening on a purely voluntary basis? Which students know to ask for that feedback, and which students feel excluded from those modes of feedback? Okay, so that's thinking of Bloom's and how that may be an emerging framework. Here's a second emerging framework, threshold concepts. This idea kind of challenges Bloom's. There's a critique of Bloom's that it's very linear, it's hierarchical. And if you use Bloom's a little too much, you might end up with heavily linear learning outcomes. And what threshold concepts gets at it is, what about those things that really don't fit neatly into any of those buckets in Bloom's? What about those concepts that kind of really take a long time to learn, right? So these concepts, the idea is that in any given field, if you want to master that field, these concepts are not just topics. Learning the concept changes you. These are transformative. And the statement that they make is actually a lot stronger than it changes your perspectives. The statement is it actually changes you as a person entirely. It's an ontological change. And because it changes you so completely, it cannot be unlearned. It's irreversible. And the two in combination is actually deadly, because a lot of us may not even remember what it was like to not know, to not see the world this way, to not be this way in the world. All right? So for example, for me, race as a social construct, this was a threshold concept for me. Remember, I was an engineer. I didn't go to a liberal arts school. I didn't learn any of this. But just my everyday experiences of race and whiteness got me to question what's going on. I didn't really see myself as a person of color. That term for me felt like a derogatory term. Right? That term for me felt like something only applied to black people. And I grew up with anti-blackness in Yemen, in India. So the idea of race as a social construct and the idea of me as a person of color actually complicit in processes of whiteness and white supremacy, that has changed me. I cannot unlearn that. It's hard for me to even remember what it was like growing up, not knowing this. Right? But you can think of, physics, relativity. You can think of the concept of energy in chemistry. You can think of even college-level reading as a threshold concept. These concepts reveal non-obvious connections. These concepts are scoped. They lead toward other thresholds. And they are troublesome. And precisely because they're troublesome, learning a threshold concept involves liminality, involves being in a space where you kind of have to wrestle with your previously held beliefs. Right? It's an unstable space in which the learner may oscillate between old and emergent understandings. And because these are actually understandings that pose a threat to a previous way of knowing things, right? Unless we actually immerse students and guide them through that kind of oscillation, what will happen is students will figure out their own conditions for safety. And some of the biggest strategies are, the use of mimicry, the use of plagiarism, to say, all right, I think I know what the right answer is expected of me in this paper that's asking me to analyze race as a social construct. I don't quite get it, but I know how to phrase it to make it look like I got it. And so I'm going to write that paper. I'm going to get the A. The next paper is going to ask me to apply race as an intersectional concept with feminism. And I'm going to go back to some pre-threshold ways of thinking about race. Well, people of color that do this. I'm like, wait, you just wrote this paper for me. How do you not understand this? Because I did not guide that student through how to get beyond just ritualized performances. Okay. So how do you actually teach through thresholds? One approach is to think about what are the jewels in the curriculum. Right? If you think about all the different topics that you have to cover, but you ask yourself, and you ask students too, you involve them in this process, which ones of these actually are transformative? Which ones of these actually required a lot of kind of time to get through? Those are the jewels. And listening for understanding. Oftentimes, because we've forgotten what it was like to not know this, it's hard for us to encounter a student who is expressing views that we think are just completely wrong. They're mistaken. But to kind of listen for the shape of the terms they use as they're wrestling with defining the term for themselves, allowing that liminality to exist, providing an environment for the toleration of confusion. And here's the big critique of the linear outcomes model, is teaching the thresholds necessarily involves recursiveness, necessarily involves spiraling your syllabus, right? Non-linearizing your syllabus, and allowing for moments to come back to concepts that you thought you had covered early in the semester. And then you realize, wait a second, no, now we got to go back a little deeper in that. There's also a humility that comes with this. They may not learn this in my class on race and whiteness, right? But hopefully, they'll take this and they'll go to the next course. And somebody else might be much better at it than I am, or they might just be in a different place in their lives at that point, and that's okay. Right? I need to provide ways for them to excurse from my course. So that's threshold concepts. The third, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly now, is inclusive pedagogies. This is really taking hold over the past few years. I don't know how many of your campuses have had student protests, but Amherst certainly had ours last November, and it was a transformational experience. Our students really held us accountable to the various kinds of high-minded things we say about being inclusive and being diverse. And our student protests took a different turn than protests at other institutions. Our student protests, our faculty quickly joined them, administration quickly supported them, and faculty and students broke out into working groups during the protests and listed out a whole series of appeals based on goals drawn straight from the college's strategic plan. And so we've been really, really focused on inclusive pedagogy. We know we've got a long ways to go. We're trying to learn from other institutions. Vassar last year had a great Dean's Retreat on inclusive pedagogy. We had our Dean's Retreat this year. And one of the things we've been learning is about the deep impacts of K-12 educational policy on our students. Christopher Bjork from Vassar has been doing a lot of research on K-12, came and gave us a talk in which our dean described as being a threshold concept. Our narrative had been that because of these demographic changes, we're facing these huge challenges with underprepared students. Unknowingly, that actually connects demographics with underpreparation, right? It paints demographic changes as being the cause. And it turns out that more so than demographics, the kinds of policies in public higher ed in the US over the past 15, 18 years now have had such an impact on our students. The incoming class, 2020, this class is going to be the first that has gone through the entire K through 12 through No Child Left Behind in higher ed, in public higher ed, public K through 12. Private schools, a different picture entirely. So you see a widening gap between students who went through private school and international schools and students who went through public school in the US. If that's kind of a negative thing that happened in K through 12, over the past 15 years, something a bit more positive has been happening in K through 12, which has been an increasing effort to support students with a wide range of learning abilities and challenges. Right? So we now have students coming on campus who are able to advocate for themselves and are able to ask for certain resources that they've had in school. These are students that have been with us before. We just haven't seen them. We just haven't seen these challenges. These are hidden challenges. And now they require support. So how do we address both of those things? Some emerging frameworks on inclusion. Marjorie Ginsburg has been putting together this framework on how do you combat inclusion. And the emerging literature is about actually intrinsic motivation. It turns out that if you try to think of students as being unmotivated, right, and you say, well, we got to motivate our students somehow, that's an extrinsic approach. And it turns out that extrinsic approaches only get you so far. Extrinsic motivation only gets you so far. Attaching a grade to certain activities only gets you so far, which we know well. But if you figure out how to foster conditions for intrinsic motivation, that brings along with it inclusion. So I'm just going to quickly summarize this, but in the interest of time, and we can dive into this much later on afterward. But some of these themes, I think, have come up in many of your conversations about inclusion as well at your campuses. Creating the conditions for inclusion requires creating conditions for respect and connectedness. Finding opportunities for students to actually connect with one another in the classroom, which is a socio-emotional part of learning. Which means actually carving out time for social connections between students in the classroom. Fostering a positive attitude toward learning means giving students a bit of a choice in what kinds of activities they want to pursue, what kinds of readings they want to take on, especially topics that they might have more personal relevance for some of the students. Some of this is connected to the principles of universal design. You might be familiar with those. But allowing that fosters a more positive attitude toward learning by students, by a wider range of students. Right? Making learning challenging for students, scaffolding that sort of deeper learning, the deeper level of engagement, makes those activities more meaningful for students. Right? Otherwise, students will say, this is busy work. You're asking me to post 10 times in this discussion forum over the course of the semester. Why? Why is that a challenge for me? How is that engaging me deeper? Why shouldn't I just see that as a repetitive, meaningless task? Right? Because it really is just fulfilling our own paranoias about our students not doing the reading. Right? And fostering a sense of competence. Is this learning actually authentically helping me learn something? Helping me do something about the problems I see around me? Am I actually becoming a more effective person in the world because of this class, because of this college? I think this might, this is a difficult question for us. We don't want to get into kind of the vocational or skills-based or pre-career preparation mentality. But really what students are asking is, why should this matter to me? How can I take this and do something with this in the context of the real pressing challenges I face in my life? And if we don't answer that, we should get disrupted. So, putting that together, we should be doing a better job of integrating knowledge, skills, and engagement with diversity. We should really tackle why our teaching methods are misaligned when it comes to deep learning. There's an urgency of these threshold concepts, more so than ever, in the looming prospect of a Trump dictatorship. But how do we do that in immersive, nonlinear, liminal ways that are going to take time? Thinking about the impacts of K-12 policies on our learning, and really thinking of our students as being this really hardworking, motivated people who show up on our campuses, not because they're lazy, not because they're consumer-oriented. They're actually willing to learn, unlearn, and relearn better ways. How do we engage that? How do we make our classes more inclusive, more accessible? And how do we foster conditions for intrinsic motivation for a wider range of students? Those, for me, are the emerging pedagogies that really matter, mainly because these rascals are going to be showing up at your campuses, hopefully, in the next 15 years. I better be able to afford that, and I hope that you'll be ready to welcome them. Thank you so much.